Welcome to the Medical Device Made Easy podcast. How are you today? So we will have a masterclass today. It will be a 2-part episode. We'll talk about clinical trials. First, we'll have the clinical trial preparation and then more about the execution with the selection of the CRO. And for that, I invited a special guest who is Alethea Wieland. She is the president of clinical research strategies in the US, and she will help us and walk us through all this process. Before that, so if you really like what I'm doing on this podcast, so please just go and make a review on your preferred platform. So iTunes, Google Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify. Just provide me a review because this is really helping me to rank on those platforms. So thank you for that. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to get notified for the next episode. Okay, let's now listen to Alethea Wieland. Welcome, EasyMed Nation. Munir Lazouzi here speaking for the Medical Device Made Easy podcast. And today we'll talk about clinical trials or clinical investigation in Europe. And for that, I invited a special guest. So we have Alethea Wieland here, who is the president of Clinical Research Strategy. And she's a specialist on clinical trials and clinical investigation in Europe and US. So how are you, Alethea?
I'm well. It's so great to be on your show today.
Great. Thank you. So Alethea, as usual, I'm asking my guests to introduce themselves and then we can go to the different questions.
I am Alethea. I have my own consulting business and boutique contract research organization in the United States, located in a beautiful city called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Okay. I offer agile, flexible staffing solutions and also a lot of training on high-performance teams in clinical research. As many people know, there's high attrition, there's high turnover, and that is the key to my talents that I bring to sponsor organizations.
So good. And you are working only for US companies or also outside of US?
I work for European sponsor organizations, medical device companies. I work for lean regulatory and quality device firms who build quality systems, okay. US sponsors, Canadian sponsors, you name it, even in Asia.
So all the world is
all over the world. That's right.
Great. So Alethea, a question I'm usually asking people on this podcast is, what kind of book would you recommend to other people so that they can maybe change their life or yeah.
One of the more contemporaneous books that I've read in the last few years, it was released only 2 years ago by Richard Harris, called Rigor Mortis. It's how sloppy science creates worthless cures, crushes hope, and wastes billions of dollars. And in the U.S. in particular, a lot of taxpayer dollars have been going into research for the last 2 to 3 decades. And this book really exposes why we haven't had the cures that we had expected in a lot of research, and what we can do moving forward to learn from these very valuable lessons. So I highly recommend that book. Again, it's called Rigor Mortis by Richard Harris.
Okay, I will put that on the show notes. And I hope it will also help, because I suppose it's also talking about clinical trials, maybe. Or some
very much.
Yeah.
And especially from the regulatory side of things. Yes, it goes into interviews with the FDA as an agency, the things at large pharmaceutical companies and device companies that are broken, and how taxpayer dollars, especially in the United States, have been wasted, unfortunately.
So the right book for this episode, I suppose.
That's exactly right.
Great, thank you. So I will put that on the show notes, and then if people want to read that, just click on the link and then you can get that directly on Amazon. Okay, so let's now teach a bit our audience about clinical trials. Or clinical investigation in Europe. So this is really a topic that is, I think, difficult for a lot of people. Topic that people are asking a lot of questions, also because of the change of regulation that is now occurring here in Europe for the MDR. And I hope, you can really help us to have more clarity on that. From my side, I don't have an extensive experience in clinical trials. I have executed one maybe the first steps, and then we had to stop. So yeah, I will also, I think, learn a lot of things today. So thank you for that. And I hope also the audience will learn a lot of things. But first, maybe let's start by the basis. What is a clinical trial? So maybe it could be first a good introduction to this topic and to let people really understand what we are talking about.
Absolutely. So a clinical trial, or also known as a clinical investigation, is an experiment conducted in humans with very specific aims and a scientific rationale. It also takes into consideration years, decades worth of regulations, standards for patient safety, ethics, conformity, and data integrity. So it's not an easy thing for people who are new to clinical research to understand. It's a very complicated experiment with many regulations that have to be followed to maintain patient safety.
So we are talking specifically about humans.
Yes.
When we are doing some experiments on animals, so like preclinical studies,
Preclinical.
so the same or?
There can be a lot of requirements still for, safety of the animal, certainly ethical treatment of the animal, as well as coming up with the scientific aims of that particular preclinical study. So yes, and then there would be a quality report at the end that sort of distills the data that you derived that help make certain claims and then shows various promise to take that preclinical trial data into humans, a first in man or a pilot study. That's right.
Good. And we are talking about clinical trials mainly in medical devices, but also in pharmaceuticals. So it's nearly the same kind of a process, I suppose. What is really the timeline, if I can say, for that? I hear a lot of time that it can take years and years to get a clinical trial done, and it's not so. Is there a specific timeline, or it's really random depending on products or the results?
It really depends on the type of resources in terms of money that companies have. And so they can accelerate to the best of their ability their clinical research program, whether it is taking data from preclinical in animals into a pilot study. What is also interesting to think about is how the regulatory authorities view the size of a particular trial and the risk of the particular trial, or for a patient indication. Obviously, for rare diseases, these are onerous clinical trials to undertake. For something where the disease is very large, such as COPD or cardiovascular disease, those are a little bit more easier in terms of getting the patients into the clinical trials. But back to your question about the length of time, it goes back to the resources that the company actually has. And it's been shown and documented very recently that on average, pharmaceutical companies need about $1 to $2 billion to take a molecule into a successful phase 3 clinical trial over the course of about 12 to 15 years. It's a little different for medical device companies. Obviously, if a company had a less risky device, maybe a moderate class, a class 2 device, their study in Europe for CE mark has less of a burden, right? Because especially if there's predicates or other similar types of devices that are already on the market, they're coming in behind. And so their burden of proof is less than a pharmaceutical company that must conduct a very large randomized controlled trial. So for medical device companies, it just depends. It depends on the risk, their intended use, their indications for use, their labeling claims, and if they're best in class or if they're first in class.
And because as we have this new change in the regulation in Europe, there is a lot of question about should I do clinical trials or not. So when a manufacturer should consider to conduct a clinical trial, so is there some criteria to satisfy, or is it something that is it's really mandatory for everybody, if I can say?
Well, there's definitely signals in preclinical when you're ready to go into your first in man or your pilot study. And sometimes medical device companies will take a look and say, I think I know where this device is going to have real utility, but let me conduct a pilot study just to either figure out some operations to make sure that in a larger clinical trial we can actually conduct the study, or that there should be enough safety signals in that first in man study to then continue. Because let's face it, we don't want to spend a lot of time and resources on a medical device for which there might not be promising safety and efficacy in the smaller clinical trials. So that's sort of the first step, right? Let me do the proof and concept. Let's see operationally if this makes sense to deploy in a larger clinical trial. Let's also work with the regulatory authorities. Let's work with the notified body in Europe. Let's work with the US FDA to really do the smallest clinical trial for the highest chance of winning, the biggest success of getting that labeling claim and market authorization.
So you mentioned about the risk of the product. So mainly if I can say, the clinical trials depend on the risk of the product. And you've said that the companies have to determine that before they can start or work on a clinical trial. Is it the companies that have to define this risk, or is it something that an organization has to determine? What is exactly the process for a company that says, I have my product, I don't know if really this product is already existing on the market on this form. Should I just make some literature research, or should I go for a clinical trial? How people have to think about that from beginning, if I can say, before to say, yes, I need to go for that?
Terrific question. Basically, if you are very much like something else on the market, you can basically claim substantial equivalence, or that those are a class of the same type of device. You might just now be a best in class. Maybe you take the same intended use and the same indication for use, but maybe you believe you have less risks associated with, for instance, a cardiac stent, right? And so it's up to the sponsor to go to the regulations, which everyone knows the internet is a very valuable resource. Most of the definitions for classification are both on the US FDA website, on notified body websites, as well as all the regulatory authorities across Europe. They are a wealth of information to sort of say, what is my device? Is it a low risk device? Is it a moderate risk device? Is it a high risk device? Now, in truth, some countries do have additional classes of a device. For instance, in Australia, I believe they have a class 4, and in Canada as well. But basically, when you look at the risk profile in terms of moderate to severe, those are typically the types of devices that then need clinical trials. There are numerous programs, especially with a notified body in Europe, where if you conduct your own very solid literature review and substantiate that you are essentially equivalent, there are certain opportunities for you to not have to do clinical trials if your bench and your animal studies show sufficient use of that device. However, based upon the intended use, and obviously if it's an implantable device, or if you have the desire to have a physician actually make a decision based upon your test report. So in other words, to treat the patient in accordance with the report that's generated from your device, that most likely is a higher risk. It's a higher sensitivity and specificity level that you are then deploying a certain outcome for the physician to then follow. Those are going to require clinical trials. Now, the size is going to be completely up to the statistical approach and what those endpoints of the clinical trial will be.
Can we remind quickly maybe to the audience, when we are talking about clinical trials, as you've said, I suppose the authorities are not asking specifically for it because we have humans that are on the clinical trials. So means at the end, we don't want to damage human life for just something that is maybe low risk. You talked about equivalence of products, and I receive a lot of time this question about how can I say that my product is equivalent to another one without and being sure that it will be accepted by the authorities. So is there some kind of tricks or tips, if I can say, to evaluate this?
It certainly is a dance, and especially in Europe, it's a dance with your notified body.
Exactly.
And the notified body is very crucial in helping to guide, even though they don't consult, they certainly will help understand what are the requirements in that literature review. That literature review is so important that you're actually creating a protocol for that literature review, and you are determining these are the 3 other devices that are on the market that are cleared with this same intended use indication for use. And here are the exact mechanisms of action that are deployed in our device, and this is how exactly we are equivalent. And then all the tables of the literature will then explain the data, the clinical trials that they ran. And, again, if you're a moderate risk and you're very much the same, it's possible the notified body may wish for you just to run a small pilot trial to assure the safety of your device, not necessarily the efficacy. In the United States, we definitely are having a little bit more reform. Mm-hmm. There's early access pathways. There's now some interesting, programs that the FDA is deploying specific for pilot studies, so that U.S. patients are beginning to get, products just on the same time point as Europeans and folks in Australia, et cetera.
So it's good because, I wanted also to ask you what is the difference between the Europe and US. So I think, there is a substantial difference in terms of regulations. And as you mentioned, there is some reforms that are maybe coming on that. But if people have to kind of have to work on that, not just understanding what is a clinical trial and move forward, but just really to execute one, what kind of regulations they have to follow in Europe and US also, if there is a difference?
Yes, very much so. In Europe, there is ISO 14155 and the MedDev requirements, the guidance. Again, all these are posted online. For ISO, you do have to purchase that regulation or that standard, and it very much looks a lot like ICH GCP, which stands for International Conference of Harmonization Good Clinical Practices. So for devices, you need ICH GCP, you need ISO 14155, and in Europe, you need the MedDev requirements. In the United States, it's ICH GCP and ISO 14155, as well as the quality systems that we point to, the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 820.
If I remember well, the ICH is free also because I work in pharma, and I think it's also on the EMA website, so you can get that directly.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's a good reference for that. So I will also put that in the show notes. What are the different regulations that people have to follow, and I will also put the links to it so that people can go directly to that. Mm-hmm. Let's talk now. We talked mainly about Europe and US. So what about the other regions? So should I create a clinical trial for a specific region like Europe and US, or can I do one for all the world, if I can say?
Great question. And, I think that there's still regions of the globe that still want patients in their own countries in order to get authorization in that country. I've been working with Europe and U.S. FDA regulatory bodies for the past 2 decades. And what I've been seeing is more adoption of and a harmonization of the quality of the data. If it's run in Europe, the US FDA may, it's not must or absolutely 100% of the time will, but may actually consider that European data. Whereas before in the past, the FDA was very fussy about, no, we have to actually use this device in US patients. But when you look at that type of attitude, there's no difference than European patients and American patients. But I think what they were really concerned with was the overall quality and integrity of that data. But now what we have seen is the quality of the data is very, very good coming out of Europe, coming out of Australia, coming out of China, Asia markets, African markets, et cetera. With the quality of the data is just as good as US data and Canadian data. So I think that, with the harmonization efforts of the competent authorities, the US FDA, et cetera, we want to certainly try to get medical products that are meeting unmet medical needs to patients faster. And a lot of the regulators would just throw obstacles in the pathway of a lot of startup companies, mid-sized medical device companies, et cetera, and make these standards that were just really questionable. But so reform is happening for sure.
So maybe a bonus question for you. So you just mentioned about startup companies and medical device, big organization, if I can say. Do you see, in your experience, maybe a difference in terms of executing a clinical trial for startups that have maybe less money and big organizations that have more money? Is there a different practice, or are they doing exactly the same thing?
That's a fabulous question. So the startup companies obviously have more challenges that lie ahead, right? They're investor backed. They have different rounds of funding that come in the door, as opposed to a large Medtronic, for instance, that has a great deep pocket, if you will. So there are no differences, unfortunately. The regulators do not care that you are a small startup company. The standard is exactly the same if you're small or large. And so that's what is, the most challenging to a small startup company is the standard's the same. The regulators don't care that you have limited resources, but the smaller companies actually have a great opportunity to what I always say this to my clients, measure twice and cut once, because there's so many opportunities to do risky things by racing through your clinical trials program, having poor results because of the design, because you raced through, not because the device failed, but because you didn't set it up for success. And so I always try to recommend and tell my clients and small startup companies, it really behooves everyone to measure twice and cut one time. And that means run that clinical trial as well as you possibly can. Never go after cheap. Make sure that you're getting the endpoints that you need to then inform the labeling claims, and make sure that you're using the very best partners to help you conduct that clinical trial.
Good. So a good message for companies that are maybe asking themselves if they will be maybe have less regulations, or regulators will be more kind with them. So no,
unfortunately not.
Good. So I think we are now at the end. So I think we are really understanding everything about clinical trials. Just for the end, so is there something your organization can do to help companies to execute their clinical trials, or is there any other information that is maybe missing here?
Yes, here's what I love to do, especially with the startups and mid-sized companies that might be bringing most especially a novel product, so something that hasn't been out on the market before. We also, as you know, Monir, in Europe, there's a big focus on IVDs now, right? Diagnostics and all these neat, sophisticated biomarkers and things with a laboratory developed test and things like that. So what I like to do is work with regulatory and quality partners, because really in the infancy of a startup company, you must build that product roadmap and make sure that the right players are in the room together, right? And we all have different expertise. I am a regulatory and clinical research expert, as you are a quality and regulatory expert as well. So I bring the various parties in the room together and really make sure that product roadmap has the quality system that we need to build, locking that device design down, making sure the documentation is really, really solid before we then go to the notified body to talk about that clinical trial, making sure that we have the right program in place, making sure that we are going to visit with the FDA for that 1 hour meeting that we're granted in a pre-sub, to assure that the study we are designing is going to get the highest success win at the end. The worst thing that we could possibly do is ignore the regulators and ignore the notified body. So I oftentimes bring in that partnership, but I also advocate to my medical device clients, the regulators too are our partners, right? So are the medical societies. So are the folks who in the healthcare systems that will eventually reimburse this. So again, without that strategy, you might end up with a product that nobody adopts and nobody is buying. And so it's a consultative approach that I bring. I also assure clients that without looking at reimbursement, medical society adoption, clinical practice guidelines, obviously the regulators who then approve it for market authorization, you're really doing yourself a disservice if you don't consider those stakeholders as well.
It's good because I think what you are saying mainly is you have to plan accordingly. We have really to. I don't know where I read that somewhere that on your project the planning phase must be 2/3 of the planning of the project, and then you have 1/3 of execution. Because as soon as you plan really well, I think there is no surprises, and you have really to do that. But yeah, there is some companies that have a different mindset that say rush, but at the end they are. Yeah, they are failing. But as you said, also I think documentation is really critical. That they have really to execute maybe, as you said, twice some tests instead of once, just to be sure, and also to prove to the regulators that you have really not just executed once, but have many samples available. Yeah, good. So great. So just for the people, if they want to follow you, so is there any places where you are famous, if I can say?
Not really, but I am on LinkedIn. So if you just look for Alethea Wieland in LinkedIn. Also, my website is www.clinicalresearchstrategies.com. And I am also in Twitter with my own name.
So I will put all this on the show notes. And just for people, I will also invite Alethea for another episode of the podcast to talk to us more about the relationship between sponsors and CRO, and to help us really understand how this combination or this work can really be important to have a successful also clinical trial. So yeah, we'll have again Alethea. So thank you, Alethea, and we'll see you on the next episode.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye.